Welcome. Today is our Move into Stillness meeting. It's always the least popular of the meetings, so I can always tell which one it is. But kudos to you who show up, because obviously I think it's important. I think that somatics, which is the topic of these meetings, is a blessing to us all, and it is very little known, but well, I don't know if I should say it's very little known, because some I would say Feldenkrais is somewhat well known, but compared to the other things that people try in order to solve the problems that somatics can address much more successfully, it's not as well known. And so my goal with these meetings is to help to spread the word and to provide education about what somatics is and what it can do for you, and to give you the essentials so that you can begin to put it into practice for yourself to get the benefits. So obviously, well, I say obviously, it's obvious to me, but I'll explain to you that in our meeting, there's we can't cover we can only cover so much, and it's an enormous field of study, and it's one of those things that really takes a lifetime to master, if one could ever really master it. So to set the proper expectations, it's important to understand that when I say that my goal is to provide you with the basics so that you can begin to put it into practice and get the benefits for yourself, that after you've attended this meeting, or after you've attended a dozen of these meetings, that you should not have the incorrect expectation that you'll have mastery of somatics. And I say that because I don't want you to say, oh, I tried it and it didn't work, because that wouldn't be true, because you wouldn't have had everything that you need in order to really say that you've given it a truly fair trial. So with that said, let's get started. And today I would like to give you a little bit of a background on the field of somatics, because it will help you to understand some of the core techniques that are utilized in somatics, so that you can begin to understand how you can put those into use. So in previous meetings, I've gone into some detail on some of the core principles, at least according to my understanding in my own practice, that will help you with somatic movement. So those are the somatic movement principles as I describe them, those being things like slowness and gentleness and focus. Okay, so those are all, it's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the core movement principles. And I won't go into much detail on those today, because I've elaborated on those fairly in depth in previous meetings, although I will possibly touch upon them again, because they are so important and we do need the reminders. So before we get into the history, as it were, of somatics, I want to give you just a little bit more background on what somatics is and what it can do for you, and what it can help with and what it might not help with, because that's all also important, to have proper understanding of, this is a tool, and you want to know what is this tool for and how you can appropriately apply it so that you can get the best results. Because like that well-known saying that if all you have is a hammer, then all the world looks like nails. We don't want to make that mistake and think, oh, somatics is the one thing that's going to be the cure-all for anything that troubles me. So we want to apply it in the proper context. So somatics, as the name implies, is appropriate and a very useful tool for anything that is a somatic condition. So what does that mean? It means that it pertains to the sensory motor cortex, basically. So that's a bit of that kind of technical jargon, but what that means is kind of what the name implies, is that if it involves sensation and motor control, meaning movement, then somatics is an appropriate tool that will give you good results. So what kinds of things fall under that category? Well, if you have chronic pain, then there's an enormous likelihood that it's a somatic condition. And what the reason it's worth elaborating on that a little bit, just because there's so much confusion around the nature of pain. And in fact, having the wrong understanding about pain is an enormous part of what keeps people stuck in chronic pain. So you need to understand that pain, and you've heard me say this before, but it's just such an important point. So please don't tune it out. Hear it new and fresh, because it is so, so important. And I promise you, if you struggle with chronic pain in any respect, or chronic discomfort, or limitation of movement, if you have perceived that your physical abilities have reduced with time and age, for example, then these are all things that are of a somatic nature, are very likely to be of a somatic nature. But oftentimes we have the wrong understanding about what the problem is. So a lot of the times people think that their pain, and this is understandable, and I'll explain why in a moment, but people think their pain is caused by some kind of damage. They have experienced some kind of injury or had an accident. And they connect their pain with that, because the pain usually was initiated shortly after or at that event. Okay, so if a person has a fall, and then from that point forward, they have some sort of chronic or recurrent pain or limitation or discomfort, then they usually associate that with the event, and they think that the event caused that pain. Well, it's not quite true. And this is, as I say, it's very important to understand, because if we have the wrong idea, then that wrong idea will necessarily constrain what it is that we explore, what ideas we're open to, and what actions we will take or won't take in order to help ourselves. And what that means is that as long as we believe a story that's not true, then we're very likely to continue to be stuck with the symptoms that go along with that story. And so if you, basically, another way of saying that is, as long as you believe that the accident or the injury caused your pain, you're likely to continue to struggle with the chronic pain or discomfort or limitation. And perhaps you can see why. I mean, that's not, it's not particularly difficult to understand why that would be, because if you have that model, that mental model or that story about what the cause is, then everything that you attempt in order to solve that is very likely to fit into that model. But if it's a flawed model, then every solution that attempts to fix it from that perspective is very likely to fail, because it's got the wrong basis. So if we believe that the injury or accident caused your pain, and from this point forward, you can fill in the blank, pain or discomfort or limitation, but I'll just say pain as a shorthand. So if you believe that that event caused your pain, then you are, well, you can see that up to this day, you continue to struggle with that pain. So it's time to let go of that wrong idea, because that idea simply has not been helpful. It hasn't resulted in a cure, and all it's done is it's just resulted in unnecessary suffering, struggle, and the prolonging of the discomfort or pain. So the correct understanding from a somatic perspective or I should say the correct understanding is that it's enormously likely. I don't have hard numbers to apply to it, but I would speculate well above 90% of the time, chronic pain is a result of what in somatics we call sensory motor amnesia. So what that means is that there was something that occurred, and it could be either a high intensity event like an accident or injury, or it could be simply due to repetition. But either way, what happens is that the nervous system learns this pattern of restriction or limitation, and so it chronically holds some of the muscles tight. And here it's very important to understand that your muscles don't do anything of their own. So the muscles are, well, they're literally meat. So meat doesn't do anything on its own. It's animated by impulses of the nervous system. So why does this matter? It matters enormously because if your muscles are chronically tense, the wrong understanding, which most of us have, and certainly if you have chronic pain, then you have the wrong understanding, is that somehow those muscles have become, are doing this activity of chronic tension. Or you may not even be aware that the muscles are chronically tense. Oftentimes that's also the case. But either way, the muscles are chronically tense, and the reason they're chronically tense is because the nervous system is chronically instructing them to remain tense. So again, muscles don't do anything on their own. They are animated by impulses of the nervous system. So your nervous system gives an instruction that tells the muscle to contract, or it can tell the muscle to release. But in the case of sensory motor amnesia, caused either by a high intensity event or repetition. So if you just happen to sit at this desk every day doing the same activity, with moving the mouse or typing on the keyboard, for example, and you're doing that in a way that is so repetitive that you've lost awareness of the activity, then you're going to develop sensory motor amnesia. And that sensory motor amnesia basically is just that there are some muscles in the body that your nervous system continues to send instructions to tense up, but your nervous system, you've lost the conscious awareness that you're doing that. That's why we call it sensory motor amnesia. So you are still experiencing that, but you're no longer able to perceive it correctly. You don't know that that's what's happening consciously. And so you will cling to other stories about it. You'll say, oh, it's carpal tunnel syndrome, and you go to the, if you go into the doctor and you get the medical imaging and they say, oh, well, look, this carpal tunnel was narrowed, so that must be the cause. And if you believe that story, then you'll attempt treatments that address that, but that's actually not what's going on. The statistics for success rates of those kinds of treatments are dismal across the board. Pain treatments, repetitive injury treatments, all of them just have dismal track records, and for good reason, because they're based on the wrong understanding. So the correct understanding, and I'm estimating 90% or more of chronic pain, discomfort, or restriction is sensory motor amnesia. So again, that just means that your nervous system is producing the chronic tension in the muscles, whether you know that they're tense or not, and that chronic tension is you're no longer consciously aware that that's going on because it's moved to the subcortex. So that means that it's happening, the activity, the signals are being sent from the portion of the brain that is unconscious, where the activity is unconscious. And this isn't unhealthy per se. Well, it's unhealthy only because those patterns are undesirable patterns. But the process of activities being relegated to the subcortex and being unconscious is not in itself unhealthy. That's a very natural and important part of what it is to have a nervous system and to be a functioning organism, particularly in this case, a human, because we're very complex and we want to do many things. And in fact, we need to do many things and in order to be functional. And we can't do all of those things consciously. They have to be done unconsciously. But that's what learning is the learning becomes unconscious so that we can do those things. And as I've talked about in previous meetings, the advantages of that are quite great because that allows us to do things very quickly, which we can't do consciously. And it allows us to do multiple things at the same time also, which we cannot do consciously, because consciously we have to do things slowly, at least relatively slowly, and only one thing at a time. So it's actually a great blessing that we have this ability to have patterns moved into the subcortex. The problem in sensory motor amnesia, as I've already said, is simply that those are not highly functional patterns that have been learned and moved to the subcortex. So somatics is the remedy for that, because somatics allows us to make that what the patterns that are unconscious, that are not functional, are not as functional as we'd like, or we could say dysfunctional, we can make them conscious, and thereby we can revise them and we can update them to better, more functional patterns. And it allows us to maintain the ability to access them more easily should we want to update them again in the future. So this is our ideal, is we want to make these patterns conscious. So in other words, we want to learn how I'm doing this thing, how to stop doing that thing, and thereby stop having the symptoms, because the symptoms are caused by the activity that's chronically being done, or possibly chronically or recurrently being done by the subcortex. In other words, unconsciously by the nervous system. So now, that's all ground that we've covered before, but today I want to get in a little bit to some of the history, as I talked about. So we could say really that the history of somatics is ancient, because this knowledge, to some degree, we could say, or in some form, has been around, has been discovered and rediscovered by people in cultures across the world since time immemorial. We know that this is true because it's recorded in some cases. We have ancient recorded teachings of Taoist masters, for example, that are, we could say, not all of which are somatic in nature, because some of those could be understood as being addressing the autonomic nervous system, which is different. But some of those techniques are in fact somatic, or at least in my understanding. So I've practiced yoga and qigong, both of which are very broad terms. So there are gazillions of schools of yoga and qigong, but I've done a fair amount of practice of a diversity of these things, and some of those I can say with a fair degree of confidence, when properly understood, and the instructions given are urging one to discover it in that way, are somatic in nature. So there are, for example, if we just take a simple, well, I don't know about simple, but a basic qigong practice like a zhazhong, which is a standing meditation, the classic instructions for that are leading one to understand something in a somatic sense, meaning that you're to feel into what is being what is being done unconsciously that interferes with the experience that is being pointed to. So in Zhazhong, classically one is standing like a tree or a bear, depending on how you understand it. And instructions are given like, the head is lifting, and the chi is sinking, and once these instructions, there are many of them, but they lead one into a somatic experience to discover, okay, if my chi is supposed to be sinking, I'm supposed to have this experience of chi sinking, then I have to feel into that. I have to discover what is that. And I'm not presently experiencing that. So in order to discover that experience, I have to find out, in this case, proprioceptively, which we'll get into in a moment, how am I interfering with the experience of the chi sinking? Because this is intended to be, the instructions are given in order to lead one to a kind of natural state, or a state of effortlessness. Because often in qigong, the instruction is like, there's one instruction that's given that something along the lines of, the effort should be such that should a fly land on your, if you're standing like this, should a fly land upon your finger, that it should move your hand, that your hand should move under the influence of that tiny little flies landing on the finger. Because in order to, the instruction in that case is given so that you can start to discover, how can I stand in this way, making only the effort necessary and nothing more than that, so that if the tiniest little thing it lands on my finger, because I'm not making any extra effort to keep my hand up, that tiny little thing would actually cause my hand to dip down a little bit. So these are instructions that, according to me, are indicating that this is a somatic practice at heart. So ancient practice, it's been rediscovered many times, but in more modern, recent times, I'm going to talk about three people who are key figures in modern somatics. So one of those is a man named F.M. Alexander, who is the founder of what's known as the Alexander technique. And he was a Shakespearean actor, and he was passionate about it. And he lost his voice. And so he wasn't able to pursue his passion any longer. And because it was really his life's passion, in a sense, it was devastating to him. And he decided, I will not, I won't succumb to this. I'm going to discover, I'm certain that I can discover what it is that is happening that's causing me to lose my voice. And so he set himself to the task, and in his case, it took him 10 years of extraordinarily dedicated practice. It's been a while since I read this quote from him, but I think it was something like, on the scale of 8 to 10 hours a day, every single day for 10 years, that he dedicated himself to discovering this. And he did indeed fix the problem. And out of that came the Alexander technique, which is still alive today and has many, I don't know about many, because I shouldn't say that, it's not that popular, but it has a fairly strong following, and for good reason, because it gives very good results. Many actors and musicians have credited the Alexander technique with allowing them to continue their careers when otherwise they would certainly have no longer been able to continue because of things of like chronic pain or loss of voice or whatever the case may be. So very effective technique. And however, a fairly slow technique because, and I'm not an expert on the Alexander technique. I've done some work with the Alexander technique, but my understanding of it is that it is primarily a proprioceptive technique. So what is proprioception? Proprioception is your sense of yourself in space, if we really want to simplify it. So you have a sense, even with your eyes closed, that you know where you are in space. So you could close your eyes and you would still have a sense. If you're sitting upright, you would still have a sense that you're sitting upright. If you leaned to the side, you would be able to perceive proprioceptively that you're leaning to the side. Now, we take this for granted because it's happening automatically for us. But as Alexander discovered, proprioception is a first-person experience. What do I mean by that? I mean that it is a well, I can't think of another way of describing it other than just to try and say it in this way, that when you the basis of your proprioception is simply the conditioned model that you have about what is correct. So you have a conditioned sense of what it feels like to sit upright. And so if I give you the instruction right now, which I will do, which is to sit upright, become aware of how you are sitting. If you're sitting, if you're not sitting, you can modify it in some other way. But if you're sitting upright, just take a moment to actually experience yourself, perceive clearly as best you can whether you are really truly upright. Are you really vertical? Or are you leaning forward or backward or left or right or what might be the case? So just get a sense of that. Now, you will, one of two things will happen. Either you'll say, well, I've arrived at it, I'm upright, or you'll say, well, gosh, once I start to really give my attention to it, I'm not so sure. I'm not, it becomes kind of fuzzy. But either way, what is happening is that this proprioception, your sense of yourself in space, is referencing some conditioning that you have that tells you what it upright feels like. Well, this is all fine and good as long as that conditioning is accurate. When I say accurate, what I mean is accurate in terms of a third person perspective. So objectively, somebody could come and they could measure you and they could discover, are you actually vertical or not? It's not that difficult, right? Somebody could just come and walk around you and they'd just be able to see, are you really vertical or not? And chances are, in fact, it's almost certain that in some way there's some kind of distortion between the objective third person perspective and your first person proprioceptive perspective. So this mismatch is what Alexander was working with. He realized that he had a sense of himself in proprioceptively that was not matching with the objective third person perception. And so his work, which he dedicated himself to for 10 years, and he finally succeeded, was to discover how to match up his proprioception with the objective reality. And when we could simplify things to say that somatically, you will experience somatic wellness when the first person and third person are aligned, and you will experience some degree of somatic unwellness, in other words, pain, discomfort, or limitation, if there's a misalignment between first person and third person. Oh, let me just take it one step back and say, because I did not mention this, but it's important earlier. that in addition to pain and discomfort and limitation, there are other things that can be caused somatically. So many things that we consider to be psychological in nature or emotional in nature, not all, but many things, such as anxiety, depression, even anger, frustration, a lot of these things can be, and I'm not going to wager it today. I've probably wagered a guess on this in the past, but I'm not going to speculate about what percentage, but significant percentage of these things are somatic in nature. I can say that with confidence because I've personally experienced it many times, and I've cured myself of some of those complaints, some of them longstanding and very severe, through the use of somatics. And another one is, in my own case, what would be termed obsessive compulsive disorder. I've been able to cure, if we want to use that word, using the somatic approach. So many of these sorts of things can be, and I'll say often maybe, somatic in nature. They may have sometimes other causes, but I would say a very significant percentage of the time they're somatic in nature, which means, like with other things, if you're trying to treat them based on a different understanding or a different model, you're unlikely to get good results, because you would be treating, if the cause is somatic and you're treating it in a different way, then you're not treating the actual cause. So, okay, that was just to tidy up that little thing that I'd forgotten to mention earlier. But now back to Alexander and proprioception. So when the proprioceptive and the objective are aligned, we feel good. We experience, as I've sometimes, I've been recently using this phrase, the lightness of being. That lightness of being is what we experience when there's an alignment between these two to some degree. And so it's kind of relative, because if the objective reality is always so, like, that's fixed. But if your objective, the objective is, let's say, vertical. Obviously, I'm not vertical if I'm okay, but because that looks pretty vertical, but then my head's not vertical. So there you go. Interesting. But if your objective is reality that you're looking at to obtain is verticality, and then proprioceptively you think you're vertical, but actually you're like this, then any improvement is going to be experienced as relatively as a greater lightness of being. A supreme lightness of being will be when there is a complete alignment of the two. Importantly, though, that has to be from within, not from without, because it's possible on the outside, and this is where it gets tricky, to appear as though you are matching the objective goal, but if inwardly you're not experiencing that lightness of being, then it's an indication that you are doing some very complex compensation in order to try and appear like that. And that's why I often say that emulation will not get you very far in somatics. It won't get you to your goal of feeling good, because emulation, meaning just trying to emulate some appearance, can be done either somatically, or it can be done, and most of the time it will be done through compensation, meaning that there are many different ways that I can get over here. And all of those different ways, meaning the different muscles that might be contracted in order to kind of get over here. There's a whole bunch of different combinations of contractions of muscles that could approximate this. Now, I could maintain some of those contractions while I do some other things, contract other muscles that compensate, that bring me back into what appears to be a verticality, but inwardly I know that's no good because I don't feel good. So this is why, in my view, the Alexander technique is very effective, but it's also very slow. Because the question is, do you really want to dedicate 8 to 10 hours a day every single day for the next 10 years in order to resolve the unpleasantness that you experience? Well, if that was the only game in town, then you would probably say, hey, I'll do it. And historically, I would say that's kind of often how it's been done. Back to the Qigong example, you find the master in the mountains somewhere, and you fetch water and chop vegetables for the master for 10 years, and you get to hang out and get instruction, which is probably all kind of a little cryptic. And you hope that that's going to work, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so it's wonderful, very wonderful when it works, but it's slow and it's maybe not the most efficient. Okay, so next, I want to talk about Moshe Feldenkrais. So somewhat similar story, not entirely, because Moshe was not a Shakespearean actor, but he was I don't remember what he was doing. He was he was, I think he was in the must have been Israeli military, something of the sort. And he was he injured himself. Now he injured his knee quite badly. He was a judo practitioner. Judo is a martial art, and through his judo training, he understood some things that helped him to put together a new system of somatics that he was able to cure his knee pain as well as every other problem that he was experiencing. And then he was able to teach this to others. So the Feldenkrais method, as it came to be called, is quite different than the Alexander technique, because it really does not depend much at all on proprioception. It uses a different technique. I want to say proprioception, just because I'm saying that proprioception is not the most efficient means, please don't understand that to mean that proprioception is not useful, because it certainly is. But it's just one technique. It's one tool in our toolbox. And so Feldenkrais pioneered, I guess you could say, the use of, and this is probably an enormous oversimplification, but for our purposes, we'll say he pioneered the use of a different technique, which I'll call means whereby. And so it's learning how you do the thing. So the Feldenkrais technique, and I've done quite a lot of Feldenkrais work, but I'm not a authorized, certified practitioner by the Feldenkrais Guild. So I can't speak as a professional certified practitioner, but I can just say I've done quite a lot of Feldenkrais work. And from my experience and understanding, it's a lot of repetition. And the repetition is done usually slowly, but then also will alternate with faster. And whether Moshe understood why he was doing that or not, I don't know. But there's a lot about the Feldenkrais technique that, at least from an outside perspective, is quite there's maybe some, we could say some superstition in a sense, because things are just done a certain way and it's not clear why. But through this repetition of the movement, so for anybody who's not done Feldenkrais work, a lot of the time it starts out on the floor, and the movements are movements done like, think of some examples of classic Feldenkrais movements. I'm going to draw a blank now, but they're usually done on the floor initially, and like lying down, and then the movements are repeated many times. And through this repetition, one can discover how it is that they're doing this movement. And then specifically also what, and this was something that Moshe wrote about or spoke about, is he called them parasitic movements or something of that nature. What things are you are interfering with the movement that you wish to do? So just to take an example, you could do anything, but just if you just want to be able to lift your arm, you just want to be able to do this movement, you just lift the arm. You just want to be able to lift the arm. Okay, so that's all you're wanting to do. You just keep repeating this movement over and over and over. And as you do this over and over with awareness, obviously, you have to, if you just do it mindlessly, you're not going to get nearly as good results. But if you do this with awareness, then what you start to discover is, that part there where it's kind of clunky, or that part there where it kind of feels not so good, or that part there where it's something's pulling. You start to notice that you're doing that. There's some other habitual muscular activity that is counter to what you're intending, right? So if I'm intending to lift the arm, then there's one way to do that efficiently, because this is dictated by the, in a sense, by the structure, by the bones. So in the Feldenkrais method, there's a lot of emphasis on the bones, because it means whereby what we're wanting to understand is, I've got these bones in the arm. So you can imagine the bones in your arm, and these bones you want to move, right? In a simple sense, that's all you're wanting to do, is move the bones. The muscles are moving bones. So muscles have attachments, and the attachments are on they're going to be on two different bones, because they're going to move one bone closer to the other or further from the other, right? So when I'm doing this movement, because of the structure, because of the bones, there's actually only one way to do that most efficiently, meaning that there are some specific muscles that need to be contracted in order to do this movement, because I'm wanting to move in this case, really, it's going to be about whatever this bone is called, the bone in the upper arm. I'm wanting to just basically move that bone. So there's some muscle that's attached up here somewhere. We don't necessarily know where unless we know our anatomy, which can be useful in somatics, but you don't need to have a thorough study of anatomy just to have an introductory knowledge that will let you get good results. So you just have to know, well, there's some muscle that's connecting up here somewhere in the shoulder, and it's connecting down here somewhere to this bone. And that muscle probably, and that muscle is probably needs to contract in order to lift the arm like that, maybe somewhere along there. So the probably the deltoid, but the simultaneously, if there's like popping, clicking, stretching, discomfort, some kind of limitation, like I can only get the arm up so high, and then say, oh, I don't know how to do it anymore, then what we know is that there's some kind of what Moshe would call a parasitic movement. So some other muscles are being contracted by what? By the nervous system. So so the enormous contribution of Feldenkrais. I mean, this is a tremendous oversimplification, but at least one of the enormous contributions of Feldenkrais is that, hey, all we have to do is just keep doing this with awareness, and eventually we're going to figure out how to stop doing the things that are interfering and get clearer on how to do the things that we want. So if you want to have, you just use that one technique and you will have huge success, because that one technique, it just works, and you don't have to have 10 years of self-study in order to have that kind of success. So you can do that actually quite rapidly. So you can begin to employ that for yourself if you are experiencing some kind of pain, limitation, or discomfort. Then you want to start to just move with awareness, and you can use the principles of somatic movement in order to make that more successful. Because remember, well, let me get into the next one before I go off on a tangent there. Okay, so we've talked about Alexander and proprioception. It's a very powerful and effective technique, but relatively slow. And then we've got Feldenkrais with means whereby, this is all oversimplification, but just to kind of keep it simple intentionally so that you can just have simple things to remember. So means whereby just means that you're learning through repetition and awareness how you do this thing and what things you're in the habit of doing that are interfering with that, so that you can cease to do those things. So that will give you much quicker results, and it's like you have I mean, I can still remember having these early experiences with it for myself, where it was like, oh my goodness, it's magic. I can't believe, how did I not know about this? It's like, how does everybody not know about this? How did I not know about it? How does everybody not know about it? It's, once it clicks, it's so obvious, and it's just a huge revelation, and it's a miracle. So make use of that. Now, along comes Thomas Hanna. Now, before Thomas Hanna, nobody really described sensory motor amnesia. So Thomas Hanna said, okay, he was a student of Feldenkrais. So before he was a student of Feldenkrais, he was a professor of philosophy, and he had written a book in which he coined the term somatics. And from a theoretical standpoint, he came to the realization that it had to be possible. He had gone to the first year of medical school too, just in order to understand the neuroanatomy and everything, so that he could really formulate his theory clearly and accurately. And he theorized that it must be impossible to completely cure any of these pain, any pain, restriction, etc., because he saw that it was all controlled by the nervous system, and it was all because of this idea that he called sensory motor amnesia. Well, then somebody told him about Feldenkrais. He said, hey, your theory, what you've formulated here, this guy's doing it. So Hanna I think he was the organizer of the first Feldenkrais training in the United States. He brought Feldenkrais from Israel, and so he was the earliest, or one of the earliest American students of Feldenkrais, and he became a Feldenkrais practitioner, and he was very deep into Feldenkrais. And then he discovered something. The next step, I mean, first of all, he formulated sensory motor amnesia, which is the underlying workings that all of these other techniques, like the Feldenkrais method, are addressing. So this is a huge contribution, because when you understand what's really going on, then you have more you'll have more effectiveness. So that's why I emphasize the theory a lot, because you have to have the right understanding. Otherwise, you're going to do things that are not necessary. And that's why, and I'm biased, but that's why, from my view, and this is not in any way meant to be um, uh, an attack or anything negative about Feldenkrais or Feldenkrais practitioners or the method, because it's genius and they are doing such good work, and I have tremendous respect for them. And from my perspective, ignorant as I might be, there's a lot that I view that is superfluous. And I think that Hanna saw the same thing. And so he presented at a Feldenkrais conference in, I don't know what year that was, but he presented at this conference, revealing his discovery of this new technique called pandiculation, which is, in my view, and in the view of people who are enthusiasts of Hanna's work, revolutionized somatics and really introduced a very, very powerful and efficient technique. So he presented this, and I think, fully expected that Feldenkrais and all the inner circle would embrace this and make it part of Feldenkrais, the Feldenkrais method, because he was a student of Feldenkrais. He was an enthusiast of Feldenkrais. He was a true believer, and it was, from my understanding, there was just no room for anybody other than Feldenkrais in Feldenkrais. So if it didn't originate from Feldenkrais, then it couldn't be in that world. It couldn't be useful, because only Feldenkrais understood Feldenkrais. And so it was not embraced, and Hanna knew that this was an enormous contribution, and it couldn't just be left. He couldn't just leave it without sharing it with others. So sort of he was forced in a way to branch out on his own and create a new school of somatics that includes pandiculation. And pandiculation is kind of the center piece of Hanna's somatics. So now let's talk a little bit about pandiculation, because when you understand pandiculation, you can take this to the next level, and you can get even better, faster results. And so it's a more efficient approach. Now, this is, again, not to say that proprioception and means whereby are not useful, because they absolutely are. And Hanna did not dismiss them or say that pandiculation was a replacement for them. He was simply saying, in addition to those, here is another technique that must be included because it's that powerful. And without it, you're handicapped. So pandiculation can be understood, as I've often described it, as an eccentric contraction, which means that the muscle is lengthening while contracted. That sounds maybe complex theoretically, but in practice, it's very simple, because we do it all the time. If you lift something, so if you do a bicep curl, kind of a like classic weightlifting move, okay, so you take the weight and you contract the biceps muscles so that you bring the weight up toward the shoulder, then that's a whatever that, I don't know, I can't recall. I'm drawing a blank at what that is called, that contraction, but that's one type of contraction. And because the muscle is shortening under load meaning with the weight, okay? So it's shortening, but then on the way down, It's still under load, but what's the muscle doing? It's lengthening, right? So this is actually this is something that's known in sports physiology and sports training and athletics, because, or in weightlifting, because if you're trying to train to failure, which is a thing that people want to do, if you're a bodybuilder, you want to lift as much as you can to get the physique that you're looking at for. So you can't slowly lift the weight. You can only slowly lift the weight so many times, but it turns out you can then slowly lower the weight even after you can't lift it slowly anymore. So you can just sort of fling it up, and then you can slowly lower it, and you can do that many more times until finally the muscle is so fatigued that you can't even do that anymore. So eccentric contractions are well known, but what Thomas Hanna discovered is that you can make use of these in somatics to very good effect. And you have to understand, we're just going to go a few minutes over today because I want to wrap this up. But if again, sensory motor amnesia, remember, this is what we're saying is the cause of the problem. So the muscles are contracted. Some muscle somewhere is chronically being contracted by the nervous system, but the nervous system forgot that it was doing it. So it's still getting the signal back that's saying something's not right, but it's no longer able to consciously understand that as the muscle's contracted. So instead it says, oh, it must be pain, or oh, it must be anxiety. Okay, so it's getting the signal, but it misinterprets it. So what we want to do is release the muscle by helping the nervous system regain conscious awareness of the contraction, so that it can, and then conscious ability to voluntarily release the contraction. So that muscle, of course, isn't going to be, it's going to be contracted. Let's understand it in terms of a percentage. Okay, so when the muscle's completely relaxed, we'll say that it's 0% contracted. But it's not just a on or off. It's not just either 0 or 100. It could be 1% contracted, 2% contracted, 3% contracted, etc., all the way up to 100. So if the bicep muscles, for example, were 100% contracted, well, they would just always, your arm would be like this. Okay, maybe that tells you something about if somebody, because this is one of those things that happens in certain conditions, is that the arm gets stuck like this. So there's a chronic contraction of the muscle. Okay, so how can that be remedied? Well, it turns out it can be remedied through pandiculation most effectively. But it may be hard if it's actually 100%, but it's never really going to be 100%, because you're just never going to be able to have it chronically contracted 100%. So, but for most of us, most of the time, the bicep muscles are actually contracted. I'm feeling mine right now. They're not completely relaxed. So 2% contracted, let's say. So the muscle is 2% contracted, or it could be 10% or 20%. That usually the amount of chronic contraction is going to somewhat correlate to the amount of the strength of the symptom, maybe not perfectly. But let's just say, for this example, let's say the muscle is 20% contracted chronically. Your nervous system is sending the signal, but it's forgotten that it's doing it. So you're just experiencing pain or discomfort, etc. So what Hanna said is, well, here's a good way, a very efficient way, the most efficient way to resolve that. Your brain, or your nervous system, forgot that that muscle is contracted 20%. So you can't then, well, you're going to have a very hard time if you're just trying to do it proprioceptively, just trying to feel into it and release, relax, release, relax, like Alexander, then you're going to take 10 years, maybe, to release that. So he said, here's a better way. So you've forgotten how to release it. It's constantly 20% or more. And this is the important part. because you can still use the muscle, right? So it's contracted 20%. A good example for most people is their hamstrings. Hamstrings are always tight in people. I should say always. For most people on this planet, hamstrings are tight. So chronically 20, 30, 40% contracted. And so he said, you don't know how to voluntarily release that. So it's always stuck at least at 20%, but you can still engage it consciously, meaning you could do 21%, 22%, 23%, because you can still, if the biceps are contracted 20%, that doesn't prevent you from still lifting, right? Like I can still lift the glass of water, which requires that I'm using the biceps. So I can contract them more than 20%. I can do 40%, whatever's required in order to get the glass to my mouth. And then, importantly, I can also lower the glass, right? So what's happening? When I'm lowering it, this is an eccentric contraction. So I lift it up, and let's say that I have to get it to 40% contraction to get it up to take a sip of water, which I'm going to do. Okay, so I've got it at 40% to get it up here. Now to get it back down, I have to release it. But remember, my brain doesn't remember how to release to less than 20%. So when I lower it habitually, unconsciously, what happens is I go from 40%, 39, 38, 37, 36, 35, 34, 33, 32, 31, etc., all the way down until I get to 20. When I get to 20, I've set the glass down. Okay, so the glass is now down. My brain says, okay, the muscle's all the way released, but it's not. Consciously, I think it is. I think it is just because that's my model, and my model says, well, I set the glass down, it must be released all the way. But the unconsciously still sending the signal, keep that thing contracted 20%. Well, Hanna said, oh, okay. So I can clearly go from 20 to 40, and then from 40 to 20. Now, this might not seem like a big deal because you're saying, yeah, of course I can do that, but I can't get from 20 down to 0. That's the problem, right? Well, hold on a second, because you have to see how powerful this is. Hanna said, well, wait a second. If I can go from 40 to 20, why can't I go from 20 to 19? I should be able to. He says, let's try this out. And sure enough, it works. So all you have to do is employ the somatic movement principles. So slow, with focus, and gentle, okay? Which means you're just now, but on the eccentric contraction, as the muscle is lengthening under load, you're going to employ those principles, and you're going to let it lengthen all the way. It doesn't seem like it should be the most powerful thing, but it really is. So if you're maybe not going to get it right away, because it's kind of, it is one of those things that I'm not a master of. Okay, I've been very, very obsessed with this for at least 6 years. And I sort of like Alexander, you know, the 8 to 10 hours a day. That's kind of me, 8 to 10 hours a day. And I'm still not a master, even close, of pandiculation. However, don't let that discourage you, because I've cured myself of so many things through this exploration, and you can too, and you can get very good results, but you have to be persistent at it, because it's one of those things, like anything really worthwhile in life, I mean, you got to know that that's true. That you have to consistently and persistently apply yourself to it. So my promise to you is that as you apply yourself to it, and you don't have to be obsessed with it and do it 8 to 10 hours a day, but if you do 10 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, or 5 minutes a day, and remember, I've suggested don't do more than 10 minutes at a time, okay? So if you do 5 to 10 minutes a day, you will get results. And you do that every day, you will get better and better results. You cannot do it mechanically, unconsciously, and expect to get good results because you simply won't. And that's why, well, it's one of the reasons why I strongly recommend you just limit yourself to 5 to 10 minutes a day for now, because you will not be able to sustain the kind of focus and conscious awareness that's required in order to get the good results for longer than that. You'll actually have a hard time even with that. You know, five minutes of conscious awareness is no small thing. You know, I mean, honest to goodness, it might seem like you should be able to, but it's a very big accomplishment. So you just commit and you focus and you move slowly with awareness, and you understand these techniques that I've described and you make use of both, I would say, means whereby, for now, make use of means whereby and pandiculation, and you will get very, very good results. Will it cure everything overnight? No, but that's why I said, like all things worth having in life, like all worthwhile experiences or skills, it takes persistent, committed exploration. This is one of those things that is so worth the commitment and the persistence. So I strongly, strongly encourage you, 5 to 10 minutes a day, explore movement with these principles and using these techniques, and then let me know what your experiences are, because I would really like to hear what your experiences are. Let me know if you have questions or challenges, because I can at least potentially help you with that. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And just a reminder that we will not have a meeting next week, because I'm going to be at a 9-day intensive for a professional clinical somatic education training, which will, I believe, allow me to bring you even more goodness in the near future. So no meeting next week, but we will resume the following week, whatever that date is. I don't know, but not next week, but the following week. And thank you so much, and blessings to you all. Bye for now.